Okay, here we are going through this book on the Screwtape Letters that you're to do a book review on. And I was going to briefly go over some of the chapters in this book so that you know exactly what's going on. It's a very quick read book. Well, as I said before, C.S. Lewis wrote this to awaken us to a better understanding of the spiritual war that's going on for our souls and our minds. That's what the book is about. It would be a good thesis sentence, and I'll write some of these thesis sentences. You can pick which one if you or develop one you want. And one of the sayings that is from the book, it says, "Indeed, the safest road to hell is a gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without millstones, without signposts." Screwtape. So basically the book is that they're gradually tempting this young man, but not with huge, gigantic temptations, but just gradually getting him away from God. And isn't that the way the devil does with us? So that's kind of the whole theme of this book in a nutshell. And I was going on, we were talking about, I went over a lot of things in my last video that I'm not going to go over right now, but I like some of the humorous things that he says, and some of these things are like kind of make this book seem like cartoon-like it's the Disney characters or something. And here we're talking about demonic powers. So that's kind of ironic in itself. So he uses terms. Okay, it says the style of C.S. Lewis is very English, so many of the terms are very kind of English-like. And like I showed you before, like the word milksop, and you can use that as an example. But it's also cartoon-like, and this makes it seem like it's a comedy at times. But it's a very serious comedy, isn't it? And one of the things on page 37, he says, humans are amphibians, half spirit and half animal. The stuff that Screwtape, some of the things that he says are very humorous if you think, are we really amphibians? I don't think so. And he says, another place he says, Screwtape says, that means God, and he calls God the enemy. So when you're reading it, it says the enemy, the enemy. Don't think the enemy is God, because remember we have the perspective of Screwtape, who is demonic. So he says, the enemy, that's God. He says, the enemy, he really loves those hairless bipeds he has created. Can you imagine? He says hairless bipeds. That is quite a deal. So some of the terms, you kind of smile when you read, like, okay, that was a different term. And this throughout it has all kinds of symbolism, and we're going to talk about the symbolism, because as you go through, there's certain words that mean certain things, and maybe even point to certain things in the Bible or certain things throughout history. He talks about what's called the historical Jesus, which is not the real Jesus. He wants everybody to learn about the historical Jesus, that Jesus was a good person, that he's not God, all the things that the devil still does today. And then, that last chapter I was reading, it was like really a gross chapter, and the way he brings forth the grossness of the demonic powers in hell and what they do. And, it was kind of like, you're reading and they're having this banquet and they're all like, you can imagine. And he's very descriptive in his way and I'll give you some certain things. So as going through, there was another thing I was going to talk about, and that was I left off with the vivid picture that he gives of not only what we talk about, Screwtape, we talk about Wormwood, and he gives vivid pictures of the characters. And Screwtape, I wrote down here, he's very smart with no love, no regard for human beings at all. He is an experienced older demon. He understands human nature. He's very smart, and he knows how to corrupt. He is condescending, very condescending at all times, and proud and arrogant. He has little patience from this little guy named Wormwood, and Wormwood has the duty. Wormwood is incompetent, he's lazy, and he's easily frustrated. He's irresponsible, but he's trying to take this advice and do what his uncle tells him to do, and his uncle is Screwtape. And and then, of course, then the real people in there that he describes, the patient would be the young man, and the young man going to war, an ordinary young man, and how he looks on things. So you can think any person can fit this picture, despite of the trials that we go through. The weird thing is through Screwtape, it talks about World War II, and you would think World War II would be a perfect place for the enemy in a war to tempt them. But it kind of, but basically Screwtape says it backfires, because he said really wars and during these times of trial bring a lot of people to trust in God too. So he said you have to be very, very conniving during these times. So he's not into the wars, and he's really not into death. He doesn't want his client to die, and to die in the Lord, unless he dies without the Lord. So, later on he says we have to keep tempting. It's better when a person gets older to tempt him more, So ideas that we think that the enemy has necessarily are not the idealistic ideas of these letters, So let's see. I was going to talk about the two. Oh, the very vivid terms. You can use them with the very vivid terms, and one is in describing this young man's. I like the picture of this young man's fiance, because he finds this girl and she loves the Lord. She's a born-again Christian, just loving God, and he comes into a relationship and he loves her. And the way Screwtape, the devil doesn't know about love at all. And so he describes love as, what is this? We got to just confuse him on what love really is, And because love is of God, but he doesn't know. So as he goes through, and he finds this patient's fiance, she's kind and she's loving, attractive, dedicated young Christian woman, and she's an extraordinary good person, and her family is too. And they become fellowship from this young patient, this young man, and just the type that Screwtape loathes these people. And the way he talks about in the book is so opposite the way you talk. You think of, how does the enemy look at us when we're Christians? He hates us. He hates, in fact, and here we see Screwtape hates human beings altogether. And of course he's a liar and a cheat and a destroyer. So C.S. Lewis uses words in very vivid terms, and this irony, which is like opposite than we expect, is what the reader would normally think. But on letter 22 on page 117, he says, not only a Christian, but she's such a Christian. Not only just your ordinary Christian, he says. She's a vile, sneaky one, simpering and with a demure, symbolic, and mouse-like, watery, insignificant, virginal, bread and butter miss. That's what she is. She says, he calls her a little brute of the main kind, and he says, that little girl there, that little woman, she makes me vomit. He says she stinks and scalds through the very pages of the dossier. And he goes on. See the words he uses? They're unfamiliar, but they're negative. So the enemy is saying, I really don't like her. It's hard to tempt her, hard to get through, because she's surrounded by a shield. And her little demon is not doing a good job. He goes on. But he doesn't want her around, which is kind of this weird situation we have going on. So, and going on to the book, let's look through the book very quickly. And get your books out, and what the chapters the chapter guides are, and the letters. So the first letter says, and you can read the letter. They're very short. They're only a couple pages each letter. The first letter we introduced into reason and reality, and he says the trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. Remember, the enemy to them is God. So he's saying, you think it's good to just start arguing all the time. But a lot of times in the midst of argument, they'll seek after the truth. So he says, it's better just to confuse them and distract them. And so some of the things, like in our life, what do we have as distraction? So we may have your phone, we have the media, we have all these things, we have distractions all over the place. Well, the enemy's saying, let's just distract them. let's not even think that they're of them as reasoning, okay? That's all about the first letter. And then going on to the second letter, which is the distracting the Christian's mind and making through disappointment. So the enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor. Basically saying, okay, they're all excited to go to church, and then as he goes to church, he's disappointed in church. You know, some things happen. The sermon's boring. The music is dull and old. You know, they have some lady clicking her teeth next to them, or youth leaders that don't understand, and they go to, all these things that can happen as you go to church. What he's saying and he describes him as he goes to church, he goes, get those people to be distractions in church, and he'll say, I don't want to go. There's too many weird people in church. That's letter 2. And then on to relationship. Letter 3 says, you must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. So what does that mean? Basically then he goes on, talking about annoyances. He said, once they become a Christian, once they want or are even thinking of becoming a Christian, start to annoy them, and that annoyance that would just get in the midst of becoming a Christian. So where should our focus really be in our life? It should be not on that person and the annoyances of that person or that Christian, like, is he really a Christian? So that's kind of going on to letter 3. And as you're going through here, let me see if I can find one of these here. Letter 3 goes, keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Basically trying to think, okay, I'm going to start thinking of the advanced things in life instead. And to try to make him think that he's very spiritual, instead of seeking the Lord, that he has that, that he's more spiritual than others. And going on to the fourth one, it says, it is funny how mortals always picture us as putting things into their minds. In reality, our best work is done by keeping things out. Isn't that true? So when he's basically saying it's best to, you're trying to put things in his mind to get him distracted, like throw something in his mind, which the enemy does. But try to keep things out. Don't let him hear that sermon. Don't let him hear of the Lord. Don't let him hear. Instead, let him just sit there and be distracted so he can't hear anything that God is saying to him. So he goes on here, says, and he talks about prayer here too in here. Basically, the simplest way is to turn their gaze away from God onto themselves. So you think of our selfish nature and feelings. And he goes on, he said, and prayer. So when they meant to pray for courage, let them really be trying to feel brave. When they say they are praying for forgiveness, let them trying to feel forgiveness. We're not all about feelings, are we? The enemy wants us to think about feelings all the time. So, and going on to on page 18 and 19, it goes on to, it talks about prayer. It says, you will be helped by the fact that the humans themselves do not desire it as much as they suppose. There's such a thing as getting more than they bargained for. Like, they're going to get them so they think, I don't want to pray. That's boring. I don't want to pray. Oh yeah, I don't want to go to a prayer meeting. So it's another thing. On to chapter 5, and he goes on to what the war and what the wars, the Europeans have these war going on. And he says, of course a war is entertaining, he says. The immediate fear and suffering of humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toilet workers. So he says, yes, it is, but it's not necessarily war. Don't think just because you have a war that you have a handle on them, because during a war, God can show up. It says, we are not careful, we shall see thousands turning to the tribulation to the enemy, that's to God, while tens of thousands who do not go so far as will nevertheless have their attention. So a war is attention getting, that we are living in eternity, right? So we think about death. So going on here, how much better for us if all humans died in costly nursing homes and amid doctors who lie, nurses who lie, friends who lie, who have trained or promised to lie. So basically what you need to do is not during the wars, during the good times, you know, and they're getting discouraged in the good times and have all these people come in and they end up in a nursing home and all these terrible things that happen during the good times instead of the bad times, you know. So and he said, and suffering sometimes is an essential part of what God uses in our lives. He says, so don't be so happy, he says to him, to Wormwood, about wars and tribulations. Isn't that true? So in letter 6, right to letter 6, the focus is, he wants men to be concerned with what they do. Our business is to keep them from thinking about what will happen to them. So he wants to say, he basically say, okay, thinking about what will happen to him, fear. So on the other hand, fear becomes easier to master when a patient's mind is diverted from the thing feared to fear itself. Isn't that what the enemy does? He tries to make us fearful. In the midst of COVID-19 and all this, he tries to make us fearful and not trust God. Isn't that true? So, and going on to what was going on in the war, and that situation is about the war in chapter 7. In chapter 7 we have extremism. What's extremism? Once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing. So what does that mean? He's talking about extremes. You know, so our policy is for the moment is to, first of all, Wormwood wants to show himself to him, like, oh, I can scare him, see how spooky I am and everything. And he said, no, that does not work. And he goes on to, like, materialists and, you know, and how humans think that the devil is just a comic book. And we want to keep it that way, he says, so that they don't really take into heart that they're really being tempted. And he says all extremes except for extreme devotion to the enemy are to be encouraged. The devil's into extremes. So he said, except extremely in love with God. They're all to, so basically saying extremes, that extremes are good. And he goes into patriotism and pacifism, and not just regular patriotism, but extreme patriotism, that you give up anything to do with God and you go into your own mode of what you're doing. Another would be extreme pacifism, or going on these marches that are not necessarily for God, but they're extremist marches or such, for your own, to look good yourself. So turning from God to yourself again in extremes. And saying that is kind of, and as he goes on here, let's see, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to keep going on because I want you to know this book a little better. So stop.